Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Straight Goods. I'm your host, Brian Lee Crowley. Our topic of conversation on today's show is school performance and accountability here in the Maritimes and indeed throughout Atlantic Canada. My two guests, Charles Cirtwill, Vice President of the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies, and Alan Parry, who is a former senior official with the Edmonton Public Schools. So in the first part of the show, we got I think a good sense of what's in the report card. I want to ask you, Charles, and I'm going to ask Alan to leap in about the Edmonton experience, but tell us a little bit about the reaction to the first report card. My sense is that parents and students loved it. We had 200,000 hits on the site the first few weeks after the first report card came out. The educational establishment was pretty much up in arms. Tell us about that.
Well, it's one of those things where I suspect most people could probably guess what reaction we got. In particular, the teachers' unions were adamantly opposed to this exercise. They felt we were measuring too narrow a thing or measuring the wrong things, needed to wait for a perfect data set or never do this exercise at all. I know it's very hard to have your work assessed, but everybody else does. So I didn't really see a problem with that. But they were adamant that this shouldn't happen. In fact, at one point there were some federations who were inviting their members not to read the report card at all, or to encourage others not to read the report card. It's interesting that this year in Progress magazine, that negative reaction hasn't fallen off because the Nova Scotia Teachers Unions bought a full quarter-size ad saying it's not just about the score, folks. And I couldn't agree more. It's not just about the score on standardized exams, but we have to agree that there's a set of measures here. So the teachers' unions were very strongly opposed. The provincial governments were another instance in a little bit of a mixed bag. Some of them were not comfortable with what we were doing because they were afraid it was going to create a backlash against measurement. Particularly in New Brunswick, we had a little bit of those words expressed to us. Here in Nova Scotia, where they were just starting to get off the ground with standardized testing, they were worried that we were going to use it for the wrong purposes, and that what was going to happen was they'd lose their budget allocations, they'd lose the political will to move forward with their measurement exercise. That's a fair concern, but
it hasn't turned out that way.
Well, I was going to say, it hasn't turned out that way. In fact, I think that from the question of political will, there's no question that the people these people serve, the taxpayers, and the students and the teachers want this information and want it. Individual teachers want this information and want it desperately. Now, that's not to say that all principals are evil and responded negatively to this thing, or even that all union people were not open to a dialogue about the issue. And in fact, that's one of the things that we consistently have gone back to year after year. We're open to talking about measures that are available to be assessed about whether or not they say anything about school achievement. And some of the most positive comments or conversations we've had in response to this have been individual principals or even groups, school communities who have collected together to invite us down to talk in depth about the report card, what it says, what other information they have about their school that we haven't necessarily been able to secure from the central sources. And that's the kind of conversation that I think has the most value. And we're seeing that increasingly across the board. I constantly get reports from school board meetings where this report is thrown down and saying, this doesn't match what you're telling me about my schools. What's the difference and why? And that's an important question to ask, because until now, anybody, whether you're on the school board or just a parent or a teacher, you had no external validation. There was no way for you to know the questions to ask. The report card tells you those questions to ask, and lots of people are happy to ask them.
Okay, well, let's bring Alan in. Alan, you've been very patient while I've been trying to get the groundwork set here about what it is we're talking about. But you, of course, were part of the team that built the Edmonton Public Schools to their current level, where they're widely admired and regarded throughout North America as one of the top performing school districts. And I wonder if, does this feel like you stepped back in a time warp?
It does, actually. It's a bit like deja vu all over again.
So you've been through this several years ago.
Yeah, it's more than several years ago. We started this stuff back in 1976, which is, I went to the school board in 74, and at the bit of the superintendent Michael Strambitsky, and And we kind of knew, we didn't start out measuring student outcomes. Well, we both kind of came to the conclusion at the same time that we were a monopoly, a public monopoly, and education is a socially legislative priority. All the kids have to go to school, they have any choice about it. And we were behaving like a monopoly. So we decided that we'd like to bring about some change. Matter of fact, Michael suggested that what we were really trying to do was to move the school system out of the 14th century into the 18th century in 3 years or less. And so we cast around some ways of changing the organization and making it behave less like a monopoly. And one of the things monopolies do is they resist, really, in lots of different places, the notion of bringing about change or measuring the results. And it's the old business of, psychologists can probably explain it. Why would anyone for aces want a New Deal? So we decided to take a look at what we were doing and bring about some change. And after a while, Michael really brought me in to help the central office administrators plan for change. And we decided after about 12 months that it wasn't that they didn't have a plan, they didn't want to change. So we started introducing some things that within a very few years led into measurements, not only of school student performance, but a lot of other things too. And we were met with a tremendous amount of opposition when we tried to do that. From people like the Department of Education, our own central office staff, who were very resistant to doing things differently, and even people in the schools. I mean, one of the things that we decided to do was to move into school-based management, where the simple expertise of taking the bulk of the money in the school system and with a pilot project with about 7 schools, taking the money and putting it in the wrong end of the pipe, and see what the schools would do with the money rather than how they can knit together all the allocations that come from central office specialists.
In other words, it used to be that the school board would control a lot of this money and decide what the schools would get, whether the schools wanted it or not. And now you were dividing the budget up, giving it to the schools and letting them buy themselves the services that they need.
The planning and the budgeting take place at the school level with the principals and the teachers to see how they can spend that money for the benefit of the kids. And that met with a tremendous amount of resistance, some of the same stuff that you're running into, like people saying, even principals in the schools in some cases saying, does this mean we have to make decisions and do we get paid more for that? And the central office administrator saying, well, this whole thing will go out of control and they'll spend all the money in the first 6 months and then we'll have to close the schools down. And none of those things happened. Oh, the principals did have to make decisions happen. But it wasn't until we started out by looking at our budgeting, planning the budgeting process and finding that the schools had absolutely no impact on how we spent our $400 million a year. None. They weren't consulted, they weren't involved. And we had decided before that the system didn't educate the kids. The kids were educated in schools. Same conclusion we came to. And so what could we do to make the individual schools better? And what we decided to do was to provide the schools with the authority to go along with their responsibility for educational outcomes. What we had before was we had a situation where we had the responsibility for what happens to the kids was in the schools, but the authority for the decision-making was in central office, it was in another place. So we had a classic division of responsibility.
Well, now, let me just sort of leap in here that I think there's a very interesting point that you're raising in the sense that the AIM school report card is, we often talk about being an accountability exercise. We want schools to be accountable for their results, but part of the response that we get back is that, well, how can we be held accountable if we don't have much control over what happens? And really what you're saying is that in order to have accountability, you actually have to have responsibility and authority.
You've got to balance those two things. You can't, if you don't balance responsibility with authority, you can't really hold people accountable. So what we found, if you say to a principal, you're responsible for educational outcomes, and but the authority and the decision making is somewhere else, and you go ask the principal and say, well, what about this outcome? It's not very good. The principal is likely to say, listen, if you don't like the music, quit throwing stones at the monkey, go talk to the organ grinders, the people who made the decisions that really impacted those outcomes. So what we did is we moved the authority to the same place the responsibility was. We moved it to the schools, and then said, and we can hold you we'll hold you accountable. But you can't hold people accountable for outcomes if you don't know what they are. So that led us into measurement. And we measured student performance, as you are, student dropout rate, because it's easier to move the scores up if you kick all the kids who aren't very good out of school. So we measured those two things. And we measured student satisfaction by school, and parental satisfaction, and teacher satisfaction, and fed it back to the principals and said, here's your results. We didn't beat them over the head with the results. We said, here's your results. And not too many people want to own rotten results 2 years in a row. So when they took a look at the results and the evaluation was done right there at the school with the teachers and the principals, they then decided, hey, we better do something about these and make these results better next year.
And how did you determine things like student satisfaction and parental satisfaction?
We asked the kids, we asked the parents. They know how satisfied they are. So we asked the kids all kinds of probing questions on a sample basis by school, and got the results back and stuck them up on the wall. We put the results out in the community, and first year we weren't very good at doing that, but we said, as time goes on, we're going to make these results more public. Because if you simply measure the results and nobody knows what they are, there's no incentive to change.
Exactly.
So we moved the money to the schools, we moved the authority to the schools, and measured results. And then took away some of the things the monopolies enjoyed. We said, you don't have a captive audience of those parents and kids. So we stripped the boundaries away and said, if you don't like what you're getting at your school, you can move down the road and you can take your money with you. And principals and teachers got terribly nervous. We saw some kid disappearing over the hill with $6,000. One school in the first year lost 125 kids.
So you had open enrollment. In other words, any kid in Edmonton could go to a school that could accommodate them.
Yep.
Anywhere in that area.
Yeah, and Angus tells me, I was only the superintendent only 6 months ago, and that more than half the kids in Edmonton now no longer attend their local school. If you go somewhere else, they'd like the program better. So as long as you do that, then people are going to play heads-up hockey and they'll pay attention to what they're offering, because if they don't, they finish up without too many kids.
Because in a system where you have to go to the local school, they really have that monopoly that you talked about before. Why should we care whether the school produces good results? Because you don't have a choice. Whereas if you can take the money that you represent to that school and go down the road with it, it matters to them whether you're satisfied.
Yeah, and the chances are that if you measure, even with fixed boundaries, that if you measure results and feed it back to the schools and the community, the results will improve. But they won't improve as fast as if you give people an option of going down the road if they don't like what they're getting.
Well, we've got about a minute before the break. Tell me, you've been at this now in Edmonton for 20 years.
30, 40?
Well, no, long 30. Time.
Yeah, long time.
Would people go back to the old system?
No, you couldn't pull it out with wild horses.
Not even the teachers?
No. Interesting enough. Initially the teachers were against it, and the union was very much against it, came out strongly. But within 3 years of the pilot happening, 2 years of the pilot happening, the teachers union did a survey and found that more than half the teachers wanted to try it, and that's when we could go full bore with the system-wide stuff. And within I think it was 8 years after that, the Teachers Association came out endorsing school-based management as a way to go.
Well, that's a great success story, Alan, that we'll come back and talk about more after the break. See you then.